Baseball is a game of moments, and on August 30th, 2015, at Dodger Stadium, Jake Arrieta was living the biggest moment of his life. Every pitch he threw that night was perfect. Every batter who stepped up to the plate walked back to the dugout defeated. The crowd knew they were watching something special. But here's the crazy part. Just 2 years before this night, Arrieta wasn't even good enough to stay in the major leagues. The Baltimore Orioles had given up on him, trading him away for almost nothing. He was that pitcher everyone had high hopes for, but just couldn't get it together. The guy who always had great stuff but couldn't throw strikes. A failed prospect. Then something changed. In just 18 months, Arrieta transformed into a completely different pitcher. The numbers tell the story. A 0.75 ERA in the second half of 2015. 2 no-hitters. A Cy Young Award. He didn't just become good, he became untouchable. The best pitcher in baseball. But baseball has a way of humbling even its greatest stars. 2 years after being on top of the world, Arrieta could barely make it through 5 innings. The dominance disappeared as quickly as it came. The same pitcher who once made the best hitters in baseball look foolish was now getting hit around like a rookie. This isn't just another story about a pitcher who found success. It's about how quickly that success can slip away. How does someone go from being released to becoming the most dominant pitcher on the planet to being released again? The answer lies in a pitching experiment that changed baseball forever, and the heavy price that came with it. This is the story of baseball's most dramatic rise and fall. The story of Jake Arrieta. Every baseball scout who saw Jake Arrieta in college said the same thing. This kid has everything it takes to be a star. His fastball was electric. His breaking balls had sharp movement. He had the perfect pitcher's build. When the Baltimore Orioles drafted him in 2007, they thought they were getting their future ace. But talent alone doesn't make a great pitcher. From his very first games in the majors in 2010, Arrieta struggled. His pitches would miss the strike zone by feet, not inches. Batters learned to just wait him out. The walks would pile up, then come the hits, and before you knew it, he'd be pulled from the game by the 4th inning. The numbers during his time with Baltimore were ugly. A 5.46 ERA, nearly 6 walks per 9 innings. Opposing teams hit 286 against him. The Orioles kept sending him back to the minor leagues, hoping he'd figure things out. But nothing changed. Every time they called him back up, it was the same story. Flashes of brilliance followed by complete loss of control. By 2013, the Orioles had seen enough. They had tried everything. New pitching coaches, different arm angles, simplified mechanics. Nothing worked. In July of that year, they traded Arrieta to the Chicago Cubs. The trade barely made headlines. It was just another failed prospect being shipped off for spare parts. At age 27, Arrieta was running out of chances. Most pitchers who struggle this long never figure it out. He had already been labeled with baseball's most dreaded word, bust. But in Chicago, he was about to meet a pitching coach named Chris Bosio, and that meeting would change everything. Sometimes, the smallest changes make the biggest difference. When Jake Arrieta arrived in Chicago, Cubs pitching coach Chris Bosio noticed something most others had missed. The way Arrieta threw across his body was unique, different from what most pitching coaches taught. Instead of trying to fix this flaw, Bosio suggested something radical. Lean into it. The change seemed simple. Arrieta shifted where he stood on the rubber. He tweaked his arm angle slightly. He started throwing his slider more often, but these small adjustments unlocked something special. Suddenly, his natural movement became his greatest weapon. Batters couldn't pick up where his pitches were coming from. His control problems began to disappear. The 2014 season gave us the first glimpse of what was coming. His ERA dropped to 2.53. He was throwing more strikes. Hitters were making weak contact, but nobody could have predicted what would happen next. The second half of 2015 was unlike anything baseball had ever seen. From July to October, Arrieta put up numbers that seemed impossible. A 0.75 ERA, 2 complete game shutouts, a no-hitter against the Dodgers in Los Angeles. Every 5th day when Arrieta took the mound, the Cubs knew they were going to win. It all came together in the wild-card game against Pittsburgh. The Pirates were one of the best teams in baseball that year. Their home crowd was deafening. None of it mattered. For 9 innings, Arrieta made some of the best hitters in baseball look like they'd never swung a bat before. The Cubs won 4-0. Arrieta had turned into something baseball hadn't seen in generations, a pitcher who was literally unhittable. The scuffling prospect from Baltimore was gone. In his place stood the most dominant pitcher in the game. The transformation was complete, but the question nobody was asking yet was, at what cost? The 2015 season ended with Jake Arrieta holding the Cy Young Award. The numbers he put up that year read like a typo: 22 wins, 1.77 ERA, 236 strikeouts. Only a handful of pitchers in baseball history had ever been this dominant. Names like Bob Gibson, Pedro Martinez, Sandy Koufax, and now Jake Arrieta. What made him so unhittable? It started with his slider, or was it a cutter? Nobody could quite figure out what to call it. The pitch would start at a right-handed batter's hip and break sharply across the plate, or it would look like it was heading straight down the middle before diving out of reach. Hitters couldn't tell the difference between his fastball and slider until it was too late. By then, they were either swinging at air or watching strike 3 go by. In April 2016, he did the impossible again. Another no-hitter, this time against the Reds. It was his second no-hitter in just 11 regular season starts. When reporters asked him if he was surprised, Arrieta just shrugged. This was normal now. This was who he'd become. That October, the Cubs were trying to break a 108-year championship curse. Arrieta took the mound in Game 2 of the World Series against Cleveland. The pressure was enormous. The stakes couldn't have been higher. But Arrieta did what he always did. He dominated. The Cubs would go on to win their first World Series since 1908, and Arrieta was a big reason why. The most amazing part? None of this seemed like a fluke. His mechanics were consistent. His confidence was unshakable. The Cubs had him under contract for another year. There was no reason to think this wouldn't continue, but baseball is a game of adjustments, and while Arrieta was on top of the world, his body was already starting to tell him something wasn't right. The same mechanical changes that made him unhittable were slowly taking their toll. The end was coming, faster than anyone realized. The first signs of trouble showed up in 2017. The changes were subtle at first. His fastball velocity dropped a tick. His famous slider wasn't breaking quite as sharply. The pinpoint control that made him unhittable started to wobble. Most pitchers have stretches like this, so nobody panicked. But this was different. The numbers told the story. His ERA jumped from 2.28 to 3.53. He was walking more batters. The same hitters who used to look helpless against him were now making solid contact. Everyone had a theory. Maybe he was tired, maybe the league had figured him out, maybe it was just bad luck. After the 2017 season, Arrieta signed a big contract with the Philadelphia Phillies. The Cubs, the team that helped him become great, let him walk away. They saw something others missed. The decline wasn't temporary. It was just beginning. In Philadelphia, things went from bad to worse. The same mechanical delivery that made him impossible to hit was now working against him. His body couldn't consistently repeat it anymore. When you're throwing across your body with that much force, thousands of times a year, something eventually has to give. By 2019, Arrieta wasn't just struggling. He was one of the worst starting pitchers in baseball. His ERA ballooned over 6.00. Teams that used to fear him now looked forward to facing him. The magic was gone. He tried to reinvent himself. He bounced from the Phillies to the Cubs again, then to the Padres. But it wasn't the same. In his final season, in 2021, he couldn't even make it through 5 innings most games. The same pitcher who once threw 2 no-hitters could barely get anybody out. The game that had once seemed so easy had become impossible. 8 years after being the most dominant pitcher in baseball, Jake Arrieta quietly walked away from the game. The rise and fall was complete. But here's the thing about Jake Arrieta's story. It's not really a tragedy. For 3 incredible years, he wasn't just great, he was perfect. He had found something almost impossible in baseball: true unhittability. And even though it didn't last, those years changed baseball forever. So what really happened? How does a pitcher go from being unwanted to unhittable to out of baseball in just 10 years? The answer lies in what made Arrieta special in the first place. That cross-body delivery that made him so dominant was like a high-performance sports car. When everything was perfectly tuned, it was unbeatable. But the slightest problem could throw the whole thing off. The human body isn't meant to throw a baseball 95 miles per hour across itself thousands of times. Something had to give. The numbers paint a clear picture. His average fastball speed dropped from 95 to 91. His slider lost 2 inches of break. He started missing his spots by inches instead of hitting them perfectly. In baseball, those small differences are everything. The same pitches that used to break bats were now being hit for home runs. But Arrieta's impact on baseball goes beyond his personal story. He changed how teams look at pitching mechanics. Before him, coaches tried to make everyone throw the same way. After him, teams started embracing unique deliveries. Sometimes the wrong way to throw is actually the right way, at least for a while. The most incredible part? Arrieta probably wouldn't change a thing. Those 3 years of dominance, the no-hitters, the Cy Young Award, the World Series title, were worth the price. He didn't just help break the Cubs' 108-year curse, he gave baseball fans something they'd never seen before. In the end, Jake Arrieta's career reminds us of something important about baseball. Greatness doesn't always last forever. Sometimes it shows up out of nowhere, shines incredibly bright, and then disappears just as quickly. But that doesn't make it any less great. When people talk about the best pitchers they've ever seen, they usually mention names like Pedro Martinez or Randy Johnson, guys who were great for a long time. But ask anyone who watched baseball in 2015, and they'll tell you, for one magical season, Jake Arrieta was as good as any pitcher who ever lived. And sometimes that's enough. They say baseball is a game of moments. Jake Arrieta had his moments, and for a while there, they were perfect.